Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's victim story, I know it's annoying, but I need to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel here. I'm a new and small channel on YouTube, as you can see, and a simple click on the like button can help me a lot. So please subscribe to support me, click the like button and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Now, let's get to the case. Sarah stepped off the small propeller plane, squinting as the bright Costa Rican sun assaulted her eyes. The humid air clung to her skin, a stark contrast to the air-conditioned cabin she'd just left. She breathed deeply, inhaling the salty tang of the ocean mixed with the sweet scent of tropical flowers. This was Tamarindo, a slice of paradise on Costa Rica's Pacific coast, and for the next 2 weeks it would be her playground. As she waited for her luggage, Sarah's mind wandered to the pristine waters she'd soon be exploring. At 32, she was in the best shape of her life, and paddleboarding had become more than just a hobby, it was her passion. She'd explored coastlines around the world, but something about Costa Rica had always called to her. The biodiversity, the perfect waves, the promise of adventure. It all beckoned like a siren's song. Her reverie was interrupted by the creaking of the luggage carousel. Sarah's eyes lit up as she spotted her oversized bag, containing her most prized possession, a sleek, carbon fiber paddleboard. She hefted it onto a cart, along with her suitcase, and made her way out of the small airport. A taxi ride later, Sarah found herself standing in front of her beachfront hotel. The sound of crashing waves filled her ears, and she could taste the salt in the air. Her excitement bubbled over as she checked in and practically bounced to her room. Once inside, Sarah wasted no time. She unzipped her board bag, running her hand lovingly along the smooth surface of her paddleboard. It had been her constant companion on countless adventures, and she couldn't wait to take it out on these new, exotic waters. As she unpacked her gear, life vest, paddle, waterproof bag for her phone, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find a young man with sun-bleached hair and a friendly smile. "Hola? You must be Sarah," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Carlos, the paddleboarding guide from the hotel. I just wanted to introduce myself and see if you had any questions about the area." Sarah shook his hand, returning the smile. "Nice to meet you, Carlos. I was actually hoping to chat with someone about the best spots to explore." Carlos's eyes lit up. "Ah, you've come to the right place. Tamarindo has some of the best paddleboarding in Costa Rica. The estuary is beautiful, and if you're up for a challenge, the open ocean can be incredible on calm days." As they chatted, Carlos's expression grew more serious. "I do need to give you a heads up, though. We've had some shark sightings recently. Nothing too alarming, but it's important to be aware." Sarah felt a flicker of unease, but quickly brushed it aside. "Thanks for letting me know. I've paddled in plenty of areas with sharks before. As long as you respect their space, they usually leave you alone, right?" Carlos nodded, but his brow remained furrowed. "Usually, yes, but nature can be unpredictable. Just be careful, okay? Stay close to shore when you can. And if you see any large shadows in the water, head back immediately." "Of course," Sarah assured him, though internally she was already planning routes that would take her far from the crowded beaches. She hadn't come all this way to paddle in the shallows. After Carlos left, Sarah finished unpacking and decided to take a walk on the beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. She strolled along the water's edge, letting the warm surf wash over her feet. In the distance, she could see a few paddleboarders making their way back to shore, silhouetted against the fading light. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, the sound of the waves lulled her into a peaceful sleep. She dreamed of gliding across mirror-smooth water, the board an extension of her body, moving in perfect harmony with the ocean. In her dream, she could see straight to the bottom, colorful fish darting beneath her board, sea turtles gliding gracefully by. It was perfection, but as dreams often do, it shifted. The crystal-clear water began to darken, the bottom disappearing into an inky abyss. Sarah felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Something was watching her, something large and ancient and hungry. She tried to paddle faster, but her arms felt leaden, her movements sluggish. A massive shadow passed beneath her board, and Sarah's heart began to race. She woke with a start, breathing heavily, her sheets tangled around her legs. The room was dark, but through the open window she could hear the steady rhythm of the waves. Sarah took a deep breath, chuckling at herself. "Get it together," she muttered. It was just a dream. As she lay back down, Sarah's mind drifted to Carlos's warning. She'd encountered sharks before on her adventures, a distant fin here, a shadowy shape there. But they'd always kept their distance, more curious than aggressive. She'd read enough about shark behavior to know that unprovoked attacks were rare. Humans weren't on their menu. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered caution. Maybe she should stick to the areas Carlos recommended, at least for the first few days, get a feel for the water, the currents, the local marine life. But another part of her, the part that thrived on adrenaline and new experiences, rebelled at the thought. She hadn't traveled all this way to play it safe. Sarah rolled over, pushing the conflicting thoughts from her mind. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she'd make up her mind. For now, she needed rest. Dawn would come early, and with it the promise of adventure. As sleep began to reclaim her, Sarah's last conscious thought was of the ocean, beautiful, powerful, unpredictable. In her mind's eye, she saw herself gliding across its surface, at peace with the world around her. But somewhere in the deepest recesses of her subconscious, a shadow lurked, a primal fear as old as humanity itself, a reminder that in the vast blue wilderness, we are not the apex predator. The night wore on, the rhythmic sound of the waves a constant backdrop. In her sleep, Sarah smiled, blissfully unaware of the decisions that lay ahead, decisions that would change the course of her life forever. For now she rested, dreaming of the perfect wave, the perfect ride, and the endless possibilities that awaited her on the golden shores of Tamarindo. The sky was just beginning to lighten as Sarah zipped up her wetsuit and hefted her paddleboard under her arm. The beach was nearly deserted, save for a few early morning joggers and a couple walking their dog. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the promise of another scorching day once the sun fully rose. Sarah paused at the water's edge, taking a moment to survey the ocean before her. The waves were gentle, rolling in with a rhythmic consistency that made her heart swell with anticipation. This was what she lived for, the perfect conditions for an epic paddleboarding session. As she waded into the water, board at her side, Sarah couldn't help but grin. The water was warmer than she'd expected, almost like bath water. She pushed off from the sandy bottom, sliding onto her board with practiced ease. A few powerful strokes of her paddle, and she was gliding smoothly over the swells, leaving the shoreline behind. For the first hour, Sarah hugged the coastline, getting a feel for the currents and familiarizing herself with the landscape. The beach gradually gave way to rocky cliffs, their faces etched with countless years of erosion. Frigate birds wheeled overhead, their distinctive silhouettes stark against the brightening sky. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah found herself marveling at the clarity of the water. She could see straight to the bottom in many places, watching colorful fish dart beneath her board. A sea turtle glided by, regarding her with ancient eyes before disappearing into deeper water. "This is incredible," Sarah murmured to herself, pausing to take it all in. The biodiversity here was unlike anything she'd seen before. Schools of silver fish flashed in the sunlight, and she even spotted what looked like a small ray skimming along the sandy bottom. Feeling emboldened by the perfect conditions and the sheer beauty surrounding her, Sarah made a decision. She'd paddle out a bit further, beyond the area Carlos had recommended. The water was calm, she was experienced, and the allure of exploring untouched areas was too strong to resist. As she struck out for deeper water, Sarah felt a familiar thrill of excitement mixed with a tinge of apprehension. This was what she lived for, pushing boundaries, seeking out new experiences. The coastline began to recede, and soon she found herself surrounded by open water, the vastness of the Pacific stretching out before her. It was then that she saw it, a dark shape moving beneath the surface, larger than anything she'd encountered so far. Sarah's heart rate spiked, Carlos's warning echoing in her mind. But as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone, leaving her to wonder if she'd imagined it. "Get a grip, Sarah," she chided herself. It was probably just another ray. Still, she found herself scanning the water more intently. a prickle of unease crawling up her spine. Deciding to err on the side of caution, Sarah angled her board back towards shore. She'd covered quite a distance without realizing it, the coastline now a distant line on the horizon. As she paddled, she tried to shake off the lingering sense of disquiet. The ocean was full of life. Seeing large creatures shouldn't be surprising. After about 20 minutes of steady paddling, Sarah's arms were beginning to tire. She'd pushed herself harder than usual, driven by a mix of exhilaration and the subconscious desire to return to shallower waters. Spotting a secluded cove ahead, she decided to take a brief rest. As she neared the cove, Sarah marveled at its pristine beauty. A small crescent-shaped beach was nestled between towering cliffs, accessible only from the water. It looked like something out of a travel magazine, unspoiled and inviting. Sarah guided her board into the calm waters of the cove, finally coming to a stop in water shallow enough for her to stand. She slid off her board, relishing the feel of the soft sand between her toes. The water here was crystal clear and pleasantly cool, a relief after the exertion of her long paddle. Securing her, bored to her ankle with the leash, Sarah allowed herself to float on her back, staring up at the brilliant blue sky. The tranquility of the moment was profound. The only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant cries of seabirds. "This is paradise," Sarah sighed contentedly, closing her eyes and letting the gentle current rock her. As she floated, Sarah's mind wandered to the shadow she'd seen earlier. Had it really been as large as she'd thought? The rational part of her brain argued that fear had likely magnified its size. After all, encountering large marine life was part of the thrill of open water paddleboarding. She'd seen sharks before on her adventures, always from a safe distance. They were a natural part of the ecosystem, not the mindless killing machines often portrayed in movies. Still, a nagging voice in the back of her mind urged caution. Carlos's warning hadn't been without reason. This was their territory, and she was just a visitor. Opening her eyes, Sarah decided it was time to move on. As beautiful as this cove was, she had more to explore. She swam back to her board, preparing to hoist herself up. It was then that she felt it, a subtle shift in the water around her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and primal instinct, screaming danger. Sarah froze, her hands gripping the edges of her board tightly. Slowly she turned her head, scanning the water. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then about 50 feet away she spotted it, a dorsal fin cutting through the water with deliberate purpose, and it was heading straight for her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. Time seemed to slow as her mind raced through her options. Get on the board. Try to make it to shore. Stay still and hope it lost interest. Before she could decide, a large wave rolled into the cove. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have reveled in it, but now it spelled disaster. The wave lifted her board, and Sarah, still gripping it tightly, found herself thrown off balance. She fell backwards into the water with a splash, going under for a moment before surfacing, sputtering and disoriented. As she pushed her wet hair, out of her eyes a terrifying realization struck her. She was now fully in the water, separated from her board, and acutely vulnerable. Sarah's gaze snapped to where she'd last seen the fin, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The surface of the water was now smooth, showing no sign of the massive predator she knew lurked beneath. Somehow, this was even more terrifying than seeing it. With trembling arms, Sarah began to pull herself back onto her board. She was halfway up when she felt it, a subtle vibration in the water, a displacement that spoke of something large moving swiftly beneath the surface. Time seemed to stand still. In that eternal moment, Sarah was acutely aware of everything. The warmth of the sun on her back, the taste of salt on her lips, the hammering of her heart. Then, with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs, something slammed into her board from below. Sarah was catapulted into the air, a scream tearing from her throat as she saw, for a split second, the massive form of a bull shark breaching the water where she had been moments before. Its skin was a dark grey, almost black, its eyes rolling back in its head as its jaws opened wide, revealing rows of serrated teeth. As she hit the water again, Sarah's world exploded into chaos. The peaceful cove had become a churning froth of white water and dark fins. Through the roaring in her ears, one thought blazed in her mind with crystal clarity: survive. Sarah kicked hard, desperately trying to put distance between herself and the shark. Her board bobbed nearby, tantalizingly close yet impossibly far. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the smooth surface, before another wave pushed it just out of reach. In that moment, as Sarah tread water in the middle of a predator's hunting ground, she realized the true meaning of fear. This was no longer an adventure, it was a fight for survival, and the odds were not in her favor. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she frantically scanned the churning water around her. The bull shark had disappeared beneath the surface, but she knew it was still there, circling, waiting for another opportunity to strike. Her paddleboard floated tantalizingly close, bobbing on the waves just a few feet away. Come on, Sarah muttered through gritted teeth, her eyes darting between the board and the water surrounding her. She began to swim towards it, her strokes powerful but controlled, trying not to create too much disturbance in the water. As her fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the board, a sense of relief washed over her. But it was short-lived. A large wave, seemingly out of nowhere, lifted the board and pushed it just out of reach. Sarah let out a frustrated cry, treading water as she watched her lifeline drift away. No, she shouted, her voice echoing off the cliffs of the secluded cove. The realization of her isolation hit her like a physical blow. There was no one around to hear her cries, no boats in sight, no other paddleboarders who might come to her aid. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She knew that panic was her enemy now. Think, Sarah, think, she whispered to herself. You've trained for this. You know what to do. She began to swim towards the board again, this time with more measured strokes. Her eyes never stopped moving, searching for any sign of the shark's return. The water around her was eerily calm. Now the surface unbroken, save for the gentle lapping of waves against the distant shore. As Sarah neared the board, a shadow passed beneath her. Her breath caught in her throat and she froze, suspended in the water. The shadow grew larger, darker, more defined. Sarah's mind raced, remembering everything she'd ever learned about shark behavior. Stay calm, she told herself, her voice barely audible. Don't thrash, don't panic. But her body betrayed her. As the massive form of the bull shark materialized from the depths, Sarah's instincts took over. She lunged for the board, her arms stretching out, fingers grasping desperately at the smooth surface. Time seemed to slow. Sarah could see every detail with horrifying clarity. The shark's rough grey skin, its black, lifeless eyes rolling back in its head, the rows of serrated teeth as its mouth began to open. She could feel the displacement of water as the predator surged towards her, could almost taste the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. Just as her hands closed around the edge of the board, Sarah felt a tremendous force slam into her lower body. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a moment she was submerged, disoriented in a world of bubbles and muffled sound. When she surfaced, gasping for air, Sarah found herself clinging to the board. Pain exploded in her left leg, and she knew without looking that the shark had made contact. The water around her was turning red, a sight that sent a fresh wave of terror through her. "Help!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw with fear and desperation. "Somebody help me!" But there was no response save for the mocking cries of seabirds wheeling overhead. Sarah tried to pull herself onto the board, but a combination of pain, shock, and the board's instability in the water made it nearly impossible. As she struggled, Sarah became acutely aware of movement in the water nearby. The shark was circling, back drawn by the scent of blood. Sarah knew she had only moments before it attacked again. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Sarah managed to haul herself halfway onto the board. Her injured leg trailed in the water, a fact she was painfully aware of as she saw the shark's dorsal fin break the surface, heading straight for her. "No!" Sarah yelled, more in defiance than fear now. She kicked out with her good leg, striking the shark's snout just as it lunged for her. The impact sent shockwaves of pain through her body, but it also caused the shark to veer off course, missing her by inches. Sarah used the moment of reprieve to pull herself fully onto the board. She lay there, panting, her entire body trembling, with exertion and shock. The pain in her leg was excruciating, but she forced herself to look at the damage. The sight nearly made her vomit. The shark's teeth had torn through her wetsuit, leaving deep, jagged gashes along her calf and thigh. Blood flowed freely from the wounds, dripping off the edge of the board and into the water. "Think, Sarah, think," she muttered, fighting against the encroaching edges of panic. She knew she needed to stop the bleeding, both to prevent further blood loss and to stop attracting the shark. With shaking hands, she unclipped the leash from her ankle and began to wrap it tightly around her thigh, using it as a makeshift tourniquet. As she worked, Sarah kept her eyes on the water. The shark was still there, its fin cutting through the waves in wide circles around her. It was waiting, biding its time, perhaps hoping she would fall back into the water. "Not gonna happen, you bastard," Sarah growled, her fear giving way to a grim determination. She finished securing the tourniquet and lay flat on the board, distributing her weight to make it as stable as possible. Now came the hardest part, getting back to shore. Sarah knew that paddling with her hands would be slow and exhausting, but she had no choice. Her paddle had been lost in the initial attack, now floating somewhere out of reach. Sarah began to paddle, using her arms to propel the board forward. Each movement sent spikes of pain through her injured leg, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through it. The shore seemed impossibly far away, a thin line of gold on the horizon. As she paddled, Sarah found herself talking out loud, a stream of consciousness that helped her stay focused and fight against the creeping tendrils of shock and despair. "Keep going, Sarah. One stroke at a time. You can do this. You're stronger than this. You're going to make it." The sun beat down mercilessly, and soon Sarah's arms began to burn with fatigue. Her mouth was dry, her lips cracked from dehydration and salt. But still, she paddled on, driven by the primal instinct to survive. The shark continued to circle, sometimes disappearing for long stretches only to reappear alarmingly close to the board. Each time it surfaced, Sarah's heart would leap into her throat, her body tensing for another attack. After what felt like hours but was likely only 30 minutes, Sarah heard a sound that made her sob with relief, the distant hum of a boat engine. She raised her head, squinting against the sun, and saw a small fishing boat making its way along the coast. "Hey!" Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse and barely audible even to her own ears. "Over here! Help me!" She waved her arms frantically, ignoring the protest of her tired muscles. The boat seemed to be moving parallel to the shore, not coming any closer. Sarah felt despair welling up inside her. They hadn't seen her. Then, miraculously, the boat began to turn. It was heading towards her. "Oh, thank God," Sarah breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God." As the boat drew nearer, Sarah could see two men on board, their faces etched with concern. One of them was shouting something, but Sarah couldn't make out the words over the sound of the engine and the blood rushing in her ears. Just as the boat was about to reach her, Sarah saw movement in the water. The shark, agitated by the boat's presence, made one last desperate lunge. Sarah felt the board tip precariously as the shark's massive body brushed against it. She screamed, certain she was about to be pulled back into the water. But then strong hands were grabbing her, pulling her up and over the side of the boat. Sarah collapsed on the deck, her body shaking uncontrollably. "That's okay, señorita," a heavily accented voice said. "You're safe now, we've got you." As the adrenaline began to ebb, the full extent of Sarah's ordeal hit her. She began to sob, great heaving cries that shook her entire body. The fishermen worked quickly, one steering the boat back to shore while the other attended to her injuries. Sarah heard one of them radio for help, calling for an ambulance to meet them at the dock. As the boat sped towards land, Sarah looked back at her paddleboard, now bobbing empty in the waves. The shark's fin had disappeared, but she knew it was still out there, a reminder of the power and unpredictability of nature. As the shoreline grew closer, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her: relief, gratitude, shock, and a deep, abiding respect for the ocean and its inhabitants. She had ventured into their world, and only by sheer luck and determination had she made it out alive. The ordeal was far from over. There would be hospitals, surgeries, rehabilitation, and the Long process of healing both physically and mentally. But in that moment, as the fishing boat neared the safety of the shore, Sarah allowed herself to feel one thing above all else: alive. The fishing boat cut through the waves, its engine roaring as it raced towards the shore. Sarah lay on the deck, her body trembling uncontrollably as shock set in. The older of the two fishermen, a weathered man with deep-set eyes, knelt beside her, pressing a makeshift bandage against her wounded leg. "Stay with us, señorita," he urged, his voice gruff but kind. "We're almost there." Sarah nodded weakly, her vision blurring as she fought to stay conscious. The pain in her leg had dulled to a persistent throb, but she knew that was likely due to blood loss rather than any real improvement. As they neared the dock, Sarah could hear the wail of sirens in the distance. The younger fisherman was shouting in rapid-fire Spanish, waving his arms to guide the ambulance to their location. "What's your name?" the older man asked, trying to keep Sarah focused. "Sarah," she managed to stammer out, her teeth chattering. Despite the warm air, "I'm Miguel," he replied. "You're going to be okay, Sarah. The doctors will take good care of you." The boat bumped against the dock and suddenly there was a flurry of activity. Paramedics swarmed onto the vessel, their voices a cacophony of urgent Spanish and clipped English. Female, early 30s shark. Attack victim. One paramedic rattled off as they transferred Sarah onto a stretcher. Severe lacerations to the left leg, possible arterial damage, significant blood loss. As they lifted her, a jolt of agony shot through Sarah's body. She cried. Out, her back arching off the stretcher. "Easy, easy," a female paramedic soothed, her accent thick but her English clear. "We're going to give you something for the pain now, okay?" Sarah felt a sharp prick in her arm, and within moments, a wave of relief washed over her. The world began to blur around the edges, the voices around her becoming muffled and distant. The last thing Sarah saw before unconsciousness claimed her was the concerned face of Miguel, the fisherman who had saved her life. She tried to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. Then darkness. When Sarah next opened her eyes, she was greeted by the sterile white of a hospital room. The steady beep of a heart monitor filled the air, and the sharp smell of antiseptic assaulted her nostrils. "Welcome back," a gentle voice said. Sarah turned her head to see a nurse adjusting her IV. "You gave us quite a scare. How long?" "Was I out?" Sarah croaked, her throat dry and scratchy. "About 18 hours, the nurse replied. "The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your condition. Is there anyone you'd like us to contact?" Sarah's mind went to her family back in the States. The thought of her parents receiving news of her attack filled her with dread. "Not yet," she said. "I need to process this first." The nurse nodded understandingly. "Of course. Just let us know when you're ready." As promised, the doctor arrived. A few minutes later, he was a tall man with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. "Ms. Thompson," he greeted her. "I'm Dr. Ramirez. How are you feeling?" Sarah attempted a wry smile. "Like I went 10 rounds with a shark and lost." Dr. Ramirez chuckled. "Well, from what I hear, you put up quite a fight. You're lucky to be alive." His expression turned more serious as he continued. "The damage to your leg was extensive. We had to perform emergency surgery to repair the arterial damage and close the wounds. You'll need several more surgeries and extensive physical therapy, but I'm optimistic about your chances for recovery." Sarah absorbed this information, her mind reeling. Will I be able to walk again?" "With time and hard work, yes," Dr. Ramirez assured her. "But I want to be clear, this will be a long and difficult process. You'll need to be patient with yourself." As the reality of her situation sank in, Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. The doctor placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to be overwhelmed," he said softly. "What you've been through is traumatic, both physically and emotionally. We have excellent counselors on staff who can help you process this experience." Sarah nodded, wiping away her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. As Dr. Ramirez left, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes, and immediately, vivid images of the attack flashed through her mind. The dark shape in the water, the rows of teeth, the feeling of utter helplessness as she fought for her life. Her eyes snapped open, her heart racing. She realized then that her battle was far from over. The physical wounds would heal with time, but the psychological scars, those might take much longer to fade. Days passed in a blur of pain medication, doctor's visits, and fitful sleep plagued by nightmares. Sarah finally worked up the courage to call her parents, bracing herself for their reaction. "Oh, honey," her mother's voice cracked over the phone. "We'll be on the next flight out." "No, Mom," Sarah insisted. "I'm okay, really. The doctors here are taking great care of me. I need some time to process this on my own first." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, sweetie? We want to be there for you." Sarah swallowed hard. "I know, and I love you for that. But right now I need to face this on my own. I promise I'll let you know if I need you to come." After she hung up, Sarah felt a mix of guilt and relief. She loved her parents, but the thought of them hovering over her, their faces etched with worry, was more than she could bear right now. A week after the attack, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Miguel, the fisherman who had rescued her, stood awkwardly in the doorway of her hospital room, a bouquet of tropical flowers in his weathered hands. "Señorita Sarah," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I hope I'm not intruding." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "Miguel," she breathed, "please come in." He shuffled into the room, placing the flowers on her bedside table. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he explained, "and to give you this." From his pocket, he produced a small object. Sarah gasped as she recognized it, the pendant she'd been wearing the day of the attack. She'd assumed it was lost to the ocean. "We found it tangled in your board leash when we pulled it from the water," Miguel said, placing it gently in her hand. Sarah clutched the pendant tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. You saved my life." Miguel shook his head. "You saved yourself, señorita. Your strength, your will to survive, that's what kept you alive out there. I just provided the ride back to shore." As Miguel left, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The pendant. In her hand was a tangible reminder of her ordeal, yes, but also of her survival. She had faced one of nature's most fearsome predators and lived to tell the tale. That night, as she lay in her hospital bed, Sarah made a decision. She would not let this attack define her. It would be a part of her story, certainly, a significant and life-altering part, but it would not be the end of her story. She thought of the ocean, of the peace and joy it had always brought her. The attack had shattered that peace, replaced it with fear and trauma. But as she fingered the pendant around her neck, Sarah vowed to herself that one day she would find her way back to that peace. It would be a long and difficult journey, but she was a survivor. And survivors persevere. Outside her window, the Costa Rican sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore. It was a sound that had once filled her with excitement and anticipation. Now it sent a shiver down her spine. But Sarah knew that one day those waves would call to her again. And when they did, she would be ready to answer. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room cast long shadows as Sarah stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. The massive grey form, the rows of teeth, the water turning red. Her heart raced and she found herself gasping for air, as if she were still fighting for her life in those turbulent waters. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Come in," Sarah called out, her voice hoarse. From disuse, Dr. Ramirez entered, his kind eyes taking in her disheveled appearance. "Another rough night?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, pushing herself up into a sitting position. "I can't seem to shake it," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes..." Dr. Ramirez pulled up a chair beside her bed. "What you're experiencing is a normal response to trauma, Sarah. Your mind is trying to process what happened. It's going to take time." "How much time?" Sarah asked, frustration evident in her voice. "I can't keep living like this. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to close my eyes. I'm even afraid of the sound of running water." The doctor leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, I think it's time we discussed your mental health as well as your physical recovery. Have you considered speaking with our staff psychologist?" Sarah hesitated. The idea of talking about her experience, of reliving it, filled her with dread. but she also knew she couldn't continue like this. I guess it couldn't hurt, she finally conceded. Dr. Ramirez smiled encouragingly. I'll set up an appointment for this afternoon. In the meantime, we need to check on your leg. Are you ready? Sarah nodded, steeling herself. As Dr. Ramirez gently removed the bandages, she forced herself to look at her injuries for the first time since the attack. The sight made her stomach churn. Deep, jagged lacerations ran from her thigh to her calf, held together by a patchwork of stitches. The skin around the wounds was angry and red, a stark contrast to her normally tanned leg. The good news is, there's no sign of infection, Dr. Ramirez said as he examined the wounds. The stitches are holding well, and we're seeing early signs of healing. You're making progress, Sarah. It doesn't feel like progress, Sarah muttered, unable to tear her eyes away from her mangled leg. Dr. Ramirez placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Recovery isn't always linear. There will be good days and bad days. The important thing is to keep moving forward. As he redressed the wounds, Sarah found her thoughts drifting to the ocean. Despite everything, a part of her longed to be back, out there, gliding across the water on her paddleboard. The realization startled her. How could she still want that after what had happened? Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting across from Dr. Elena Cortez, the hospital's staff psychologist. The office was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture, a stark contrast to the clinical sterility of the rest of the hospital. So, Sarah, Dr. Cortez began, her voice soothing. Why don't you tell me about what happened? Sarah took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap. I was paddleboarding. It was a beautiful day. The water was so clear. Her voice trailed off as the memories flooded back. Dr. Cortez nodded encouragingly. Take your time. We're in no rush here. Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to continue. I saw a shadow in the water. I thought it was just a big fish or maybe a ray, but then, as Sarah recounted the attack, her voice grew stronger. She described the initial impact, the struggle to stay afloat, the terror of seeing the shark circling back for another attack. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face, but she felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the burden had lessened its weight. Dr. Cortez listened intently, offering tissues and gentle prompts when Sarah faltered. When the story was complete, she leaned forward, her expression compassionate. Sarah, what you've been through is incredibly traumatic. It's natural to feel afraid, angry, even guilty. These are all normal responses to an abnormal situation. Guilty? Sarah asked, confused. Why would I feel guilty? Dr. Cortez smiled softly. Some survivors feel guilty for putting themselves in danger or for surviving when others might not have. Do you feel any of that? Sarah considered the question. I guess I do feel guilty for ignoring the warnings. Carlos, the local guide, he told me to be careful. But I thought I knew better. I pushed too far. That's a common reaction, Dr. Cortez assured her. But it's important to remember that you're not to blame for what happened. Sharks are a natural part of the ocean ecosystem. You couldn't have predicted or prevented the attack. As their session continued, Sarah found herself opening up more. She talked about her love for the ocean, her passion for paddleboarding, and her fear that she might never be able to enjoy those things again. It's okay to be afraid, Dr. Cortez said, but it's also okay to still love the things you loved before. Your experience doesn't negate all the joy and peace the ocean has brought you over the years. By the time the session ended, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but also strangely energized. For the first time since the attack, she felt a glimmer of hope that she might be able to move past this trauma. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into her physical therapy with renewed determination. Each small victory, wiggling her toes, bending her knee, taking a step with assistance, felt like a triumph over the shark that had tried to take everything from her. One afternoon, as Sarah was working with her physical therapist, a commotion in the hallway caught her attention. She looked up to see a familiar face, Carlos, the paddleboarding guide who had warned her about the sharks. Sarah, he exclaimed, his face a mix of relief and concern. I've been trying to visit for days. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Carlos, you have nothing to be sorry for. If anything, I should apologize to you. I should have listened to your warning. Carlos shook his head vehemently. No, the ocean, she is unpredictable. We can take precautions, but in the end, nature will do as she will. As they talked, Sarah found herself drawn into Carlos's passion for the ocean. Despite the attack, his love for the water and its inhabitants hadn't diminished. He spoke of conservation efforts, of the delicate balance between humans and marine life, and of the beauty that could still be found beneath the waves. The shark, Carlos said softly. It was not evil. It was simply being what nature made it to be. We enter their world and we must respect that. Sarah nodded, surprised to find that she agreed. The attack had been terrifying, life-altering, but she couldn't bring herself to hate the shark or the ocean. They were forces of nature, neither good nor evil, simply existing as they had for millions of years. As Carlos left, promising to visit again, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could let her fear define her, could turn her back on the ocean and all it had meant to her. Or she could choose to move forward, to reclaim her love for the water while respecting its power and unpredictability. That night, as she lay in bed, Sarah made her decision. She would not let this attack be the end of her story. It would be a chapter, yes, a difficult and painful one, but not the conclusion. She would heal, she would grow stronger, and one day she would return to the ocean. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's dreams were not of teeth and terror, but of sunlight, dancing on waves and the freedom of gliding across open water. The path ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time since the attack, Sarah felt ready to face it. She was a survivor, and survivors persevere. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across Sarah's bed. She stirred, blinking away the remnants of sleep, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the dull ache in her leg reminded her, and the events of the past weeks came rushing back. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, pushing herself up into a sitting position. Dr. Ramirez entered, followed by a team of nurses. His face was serious but not grim. "Good morning, Sarah. How are you feeling today?" Sarah took a moment to assess herself. "Better, I think. The pain isn't as bad." Dr. Ramirez nodded, pleased. "That's good to hear. We're going to remove your stitches today and take a closer look at how you're healing. Are you ready?" Sarah swallowed, hard but nodded. As the nurses carefully removed the bandages, she steeled herself to look at her leg. The sight was still shocking. Angry red lines crisscrossed her skin where the shark's teeth had torn into her flesh. But the wounds were closed now, no longer the gaping, terrifying gashes they had been. Dr. Ramirez examined her leg carefully, his touch gentle but clinical. "The healing is progressing well," he said after a few minutes. "There's no sign of infection, and the tissue is knitting together nicely. You're going to have some impressive scars, but with time and proper care, you should regain most, if not all, of your mobility." Relief washed over Sarah. "So I'll be able to walk again? To swim?" The doctor smiled. "With time and hard work, yes. But Sarah, I want you to understand, this is just the beginning of your recovery. You have months of physical therapy ahead of you, and it won't be easy." As if on cue, the door opened again, and a tall, muscular woman entered. She had a no-nonsense hair about her, but her eyes were kind. "Sarah, this is Maria," Dr. Ramirez introduced. "She'll be your physical therapist." Maria stepped forward, offering a firm handshake. "Nice to meet you, Sarah. Are you ready to get to work?" Sarah nodded, determination setting in. More than ready. The next few hours were a blur of pain and exertion as Maria put Sarah through a series of exercises designed to test her range of motion and strength. By the end, Sarah was drenched in sweat, her leg throbbing, but she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced since before the attack. "You did well today," Maria said as she helped Sarah back into bed. "But this is just the beginning. Tomorrow will be harder, and the day after that, even more so. Are you up for it?" Sarah met Maria's gaze, her jaw set. "Bring it on." As the days passed, Sarah fell into a grueling routine of physical therapy sessions, punctuated by visits from Dr. Cortez to work on her mental recovery. The nightmares still came, but less frequently now, and Sarah was learning techniques to manage her anxiety. One afternoon, about a week into her therapy, Sarah was working with Maria on standing exercises when a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Sarah's heart leapt as she recognized the voices. Her parents had arrived. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. Her mother burst into the room first, her face a mask of worry that quickly gave way to relief. "Oh, Sarah," she cried, rushing to embrace her daughter. Sarah's father followed close behind, his usually stoic face etched with concern. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, joining the embrace. For a moment, Sarah let herself be enveloped in their love, feeling like a child again. But as they pulled away, reality set back in. She saw the fear in their eyes as they took in her injured leg, the hospital equipment surrounding her. "I'm okay," she said quickly, trying to reassure them. "Really, I'm getting better every day." Her mother wiped away tears. "We were so worried when we got the call." "I know, Mom," Sarah interrupted gently. "I'm sorry I didn't want you to come right away. I needed some time to process everything." Her father nodded, understanding, in his eyes. "We get it, sweetie. We're just glad we're here now. What can we do to help?" Sarah smiled, grateful for their support. Just being here is enough. Over the next few days, Sarah's parents became fixtures in her hospital room. They attended her therapy sessions, cheering her on as she pushed through the pain. They listened as she recounted the attack, holding her hand through the difficult parts. And slowly Sarah felt herself growing stronger, both physically and emotionally. One evening, as Sarah was resting after a particularly grueling therapy session, Carlos appeared in her doorway, a hesitant smile on his face. "May I come in?" he asked, glancing uncertainly at Sarah's parents. Sarah nodded, making introductions. To her relief, her parents welcomed Carlos warmly, thanking him for his part in her rescue and recovery. As they talked, the conversation turned to Sarah's future. Her mother, ever practical, asked, "So, what's next, honey? When you're well enough to leave the hospital, will you come home with us?" Sarah felt a pang of uncertainty. The thought of returning to her parents' landlocked home in the Midwest, far from the ocean she loved despite everything, filled her with a sense of loss. Carlos must have sensed her hesitation because he spoke up. "You know, Sarah, there's a rehabilitation center not far from here, right on the beach. They specialize in helping people recover from marine accidents and injuries. Many of their patients are surfers and divers who've had close encounters with sharks." Sarah's eyes widened with interest. "Really? I had no idea such a place existed." Carlos nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, they not only help with physical recovery, but also with getting people back in the water. They understand the unique challenges of overcoming a trauma like yours." Sarah's parents exchanged a look, clearly uncertain about the idea of their daughter staying in Costa Rica, so close to where she'd been attacked. But Sarah felt a spark of hope ignite within her. That sounds perfect, actually," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I don't want to run away from this. I want to face it head on." Her father leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure, Sarah? After everything that's happened?" Sarah reached out, taking her father's hand. "I'm sure, Dad. I know it might be hard to understand, but I need to do this. The ocean has been such a huge part of my life. I can't let one terrible experience take that away from me." Her mother sighed, a mix of worry and pride in her eyes. "You've always been stubborn," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "If this is what you really want, we'll support you." Relief washed over Sarah. She turned to Carlos. "Can you tell me more about this place?" As Carlos described the rehabilitation center, its programs, and its success stories, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her path forward, not running from her fear, but confronting it, working through it, and eventually conquering it. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, her parents sleeping in chairs beside her, she found herself thinking about the future for the first time since the attack. She imagined herself standing on a beach, waves lapping at her feet. In her mind's eye, she saw herself taking a deep breath, then stepping into the water, one careful step at a time. The image didn't fill her with terror as it once might have. Instead, she felt a mix of anticipation and determination. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but Sarah knew now that she was strong enough to face it. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's dreams were not of teeth and terror, but of healing, of strength, and of the endless possibilities that lay beyond the horizon. The ocean had nearly taken her life, but it had also given her a new purpose. And Sarah was ready to embrace it one wave at a time. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink as Sarah stood on the balcony of the rehabilitation center. She leaned heavily on her crutches, her injured legs still not strong enough to bear her full weight. The salty breeze caressed her face, carrying with it memories both thrilling and terrifying. It had been 3 weeks since she'd left the hospital and checked into the Oceano Healing Center. The facility, perched on a cliff overlooking a secluded beach, was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It was part hospital, part resort, and part marine research center, all dedicated to helping people like her, survivors of marine accidents, who needed to heal both body and mind. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" A voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to see Dr. Elena Reyes, the center's lead psychologist, approaching with a warm smile. "It is," Sarah agreed, turning back to the ocean. "View. I never thought I'd be able to look at the water again without panicking. But here I am." Dr. Reyes joined her at the railing. "That's significant progress, Sarah. How are you feeling about tomorrow's session?" Sarah took a deep breath, her grip tightening on her crutches. Nervous, she admitted, excited but terrified. Tomorrow would be her first attempt at water therapy, actually entering the ocean since the attack. The thought made her heart race, but she was determined to face her fear. "That's a normal reaction," Dr. Reyes assured her. "Remember, we'll be right there with you. We'll go at your pace and you can stop at any time." Sarah nodded, grateful for the support. As they stood in companionable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear beneath the horizon, Sarah reflected on her journey so far. The physical therapy had been grueling. Every day she pushed her body to its limits, working to regain strength and mobility in her injured leg. The scars were still angry and red, a constant reminder of the teeth that had torn into her flesh. But slowly, surely, she was getting stronger. The psychological healing had been even more challenging. Sarah had spent hours with Dr. Reyes and other therapists, working through her trauma, confronting her fears, and learning coping mechanisms for her anxiety and PTSD. "Penny for your thoughts?" Dr. Reyes asked, breaking the silence. Sarah smiled ruefully. "Just thinking about how far I've come, and how far I still have to go." "Progress isn't always linear," Dr. Reyes reminded her. "There will be setbacks, but what matters is that you keep moving forward." As they turned to head back inside, Sarah caught sight of a dorsal fin in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat, her body tensing automatically. Dr. Reyes noticed her reaction immediately. "What do you see, Sarah?" she asked calmly. Sarah swallowed hard. "A fin. Out there." She pointed with a shaking hand. Dr. Reyes nodded, her voice steady. "Good. Now let's analyze what we're seeing. What kind of fin is it?" Sarah forced herself to look more closely, using the techniques she'd learned in her therapy sessions. It's too small to be a shark. And the movement isn't right. I think it's a dolphin." As if on cue, the dolphin leapt from the water, its sleek body arcing gracefully before splashing back down. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, a small laugh escaping her lips. "Well done, Sarah," Dr. Reyes said, squeezing her shoulder gently. "You faced your fear and used your knowledge to assess the situation rationally. That's exactly what we've been working towards." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Sarah stood on the beach, her toes digging into the warm sand, staring at the gentle waves lapping at the shore. She was dressed in a wetsuit, a concession to both her still healing wounds and her lingering fear of exposing her vulnerable skin to the water. Dr. Reyes stood beside her, along with Marco, one of the center's physical therapists who specialized in aquatic rehabilitation. A small group of other patients and staff had gathered to watch and offer support, but they kept a respectful distance. "Remember, Sarah," Marco said, his voice gentle but firm, "we're not here to push you beyond your limits. We're here to help. You find them and then gradually expand them. Are you ready to begin?" Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it over the sound of the waves. Slowly, leaning on Marco for support, Sarah took her first step towards the water. The cool foam washed over her feet and she gasped, memories of the attack threatening to overwhelm her. "Breathe, Sarah," Dr. Reyes coached from her other side. "Focus on the here and now. What do you feel?" Sarah closed her eyes, centering herself. "Cold," she said after a moment. "The water is cold on my feet. The sand is shifting under my toes." "Good," Dr. Reyes encouraged. "What else?" "The sun on my face," Sarah continued, her voice growing steadier. "The breeze. The smell of salt into the air." With each observation, Sarah felt her panic receding. She opened her eyes, looking down at her feet in the water. She was doing it. She was in the ocean. Emboldened, Sarah took another step, then another. The water rose to her ankles, then her calves. When it reached her knees, lapping at the lowest of her scars, she paused. "I need a minute," she said, her voice shaky. "Take all the time you need," Marco assured her. "This is incredible progress already." For several long moments, Sarah stood there, feeling the push and pull of the waves against her legs. She focused on her breathing, on the sensations around her, on the solid presence of Marco and Dr. Reyes beside her. Then, decision made, she took another step forward. They stayed in the water for nearly an hour, never going deeper than Sarah's waist. By the time they returned to shore, Sarah was exhausted but exhilarated. She had done it. She had gone back into the ocean. As she sat on the beach, wrapped in a warm towel, Sarah watched the waves with new eyes. The fear was still there, a low hum in the back of her mind, but it no longer consumed her. For the first time since the attack, she felt a flicker of her old love for the ocean returning. "How do you feel?" Dr. Reyes asked, sitting down beside her. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Proud," she said finally. "Tired, a little scared still, but hopeful." Dr. Reyes smiled. "Those are all perfectly valid feelings. You've taken a huge step today, Sarah. You should be very proud of yourself." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Sarah watched the other patients and staff going about their day. Some were in the water, working with therapists on various exercises. Others were walking on the beach, their gaits uneven but determined. All of them were survivors, just like her. A familiar face caught her eye. Carlos, the paddleboarding guide who had warned her about the sharks all those weeks ago. He was helping a young man with a prosthetic leg navigate the shallow waters on a modified paddleboard. Seeing Carlos stirred something in Sarah. Despite everything, despite the terror and pain and long road to recovery, she realized that her love for the ocean and for paddleboarding hadn't died. It had been buried, yes, nearly crushed under the weight of her trauma, but it was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. As if sensing her gaze, Carlos looked up and waved. Sarah waved back, a genuine smile spreading across her face. In that moment, she made a decision. One day, when she was stronger, when her body and mind had healed further, she would get back on a paddleboard. The shark had taken much from her, but it wouldn't take this. Sarah turned to Dr. Reyes, determination shining in her eyes. "I want to try paddleboarding again," she said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Do you think that's possible?" Dr. Reyes regarded her thoughtfully. "With continued hard work and therapy, yes, I believe it's possible. But Sarah, are you sure that's what you want?" Sarah nodded, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "I am. The ocean nearly killed me, but it's also been such a huge part of my life. I don't want to let fear rob me of something I love." As the day wore on, Sarah felt a newfound sense of purpose settling over her. The road ahead was still long and undoubtedly challenging. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt and fear. But for the first time since the attack, Sarah could see a future where she was whole again, where she could embrace her passion without being crippled by terror. She looked out at the endless expanse of the Pacific, feeling a mix of respect, fear and love. The ocean, in all its beauty and danger, had nearly destroyed her, but it had also given her a new strength, a resilience she never knew she possessed. And one day, Sarah vowed, she would glide across its surface again, not as a victim but as a survivor. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Sarah woke, her body tense with anticipation. Today marked a significant milestone in her recovery, her first attempt at paddleboarding since the attack. She'd been working towards this moment for months, pushing through grueling physical therapy sessions and confronting her deepest fears in countless hours of psychological counseling. As she dressed in her wetsuit, Sarah caught sight of her scars in the mirror. The angry red lines had faded to silvery streaks, a permanent reminder of her encounter with the shark. She traced them with her fingers, no longer flinching at the touch. "You've got this," she whispered to her reflection, drawing strength from the determination she saw in her own eyes. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. "Sarah, are you ready?" It was Carlos, the paddleboarding instructor, who had become a close friend and ally in her recovery. "Coming," she called back, taking one last deep breath before opening the door. Carlos stood there, his usual easy smile in place, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked as they walked towards the beach. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Nervous," she admitted. "Excited, terrified, all of the above." Carlos nodded understandingly. "That's normal. Remember, we're taking this slow. You're in control every step of the way." As they reached the shore, Sarah saw that they weren't alone. Dr. Reyes, her psychologist, was there, along with Marco, her physical therapist. A small group of other patients from the rehabilitation center had gathered as well, offering silent support. Dr. Reyes approached, her face calm and reassuring. "Sarah, before we begin, I want to check in with you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how's your anxiety right now?" Sarah closed her eyes, assessing her internal state as she'd been taught. 7, she said after a moment. "Maybe 8. "That's okay," Dr. Reyes assured her. "Remember your breathing exercises. We can take as much time as you need." Sarah nodded, focusing on her breath. "In for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. Slowly, she felt her heart rate begin to slow, the tight knot in her stomach loosening. Slightly. "Okay," she said, finally opening her eyes. "I'm ready." Carlos brought over the paddleboard, a new one, specially designed for rehabilitation purposes. It was wider and more stable than a standard board, with additional grip to help. Sarah maintained her balance despite her still healing leg. As they went through the pre-launch routine, checking the board and paddle, Sarah found comfort in the familiar motions. Her body remembered this, even if her mind was still unsure. Finally, it was time. Sarah stood at the water's edge, the gentle waves lapping at her feet. She stared out at the ocean, its vast expanse both beautiful and terrifying. "Remember," Carlos said softly, "we're staying in the shallows. You can touch the bottom at any time, and I'll be right beside you the whole way." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. With Carlos's help, she positioned the board in the water and carefully lay down on it, just as she had done countless times before the attack. The feel of the board beneath her, the cool water on her hands, it was all achingly familiar. "Whenever you're ready," Carlos encouraged, "start paddling out." Sarah took a deep breath and began to paddle. The motion felt strange at first, her muscles protesting after months of disuse. But with each stroke, she felt more of her old skill returning. As they moved further from shore, Sarah's anxiety began to spike. The water was deeper here, darker. She could feel her breath coming faster, her heart racing. "Sarah," Carlos's voice cut through her rising panic. "Look at me." She turned her head, meeting his steady gaze. "You're safe," he said firmly. "I'm right here. Dr. Reyes and Marco are watching from shore. Nothing bad is going to happen. Do you want to keep going or head back?" Sarah closed her eyes, focusing on her breath again. When she opened them, she felt calmer. "Keep going," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. They paddled further out, staying parallel to the shore. Sarah kept her eyes focused on the horizon, trying not to think about what might be lurking beneath the surface. Suddenly, a flash of movement in the water caught her eye. Sarah froze, her whole body tensing as memories of the attack flooded back. "Sarah," Carlos said urgently, noticing her reaction. "What do you see?" She pointed with a shaking hand. "There's something in the water." Carlos looked where she was pointing, then back at her with a gentle smile. "You're right, there is. But look closer." "What do you see?" Forcing herself to focus, Sarah studied the water. Her sleek grey body arced through the waves, followed by another and another. "Dolphins," she breathed, relief washing over her. "That's right," Carlos confirmed. "A whole pod of them. They're curious about us, but they're not a threat. Do you want to watch them for a bit?" Sarah nodded, her fear giving way to wonder as she watched the dolphins play. They leapt and dove, their joyful energy infectious. For the first time since the attack, Sarah felt a spark of her old love for the ocean rekindling. After a while, Carlos suggested they head back to shore. Sarah was surprised to realize she felt a twinge of disappointment. Despite her fear, part of her wasn't ready for the session to end. As they paddled back, Sarah found herself reflecting on the experience. Yes, she had been afraid. Yes, there had been moments of panic, but she had pushed through, faced her fear head-on, and in doing so she had reclaimed a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. Back on the beach, Sarah was engulfed in a group hug by her fellow patients and the staff. There were tears in more than a few eyes, including her own. Dr. Reyes approached, her face beaming with pride. "How do you feel, Sarah?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Overwhelmed," she said finally, "but good, really good." "You should be incredibly proud of yourself," Dr. Reyes said. "You've come so far. How would you rate your anxiety now on that same 1 to 10 scale?" Sarah was surprised to realize the knot of fear in her stomach had loosened considerably. "Maybe a 4, she said, sounding almost surprised at her own answer. Dr. Reyes nodded approvingly. "That's fantastic progress. Remember, healing isn't linear. You might feel more anxious next time or less. The important thing is that you're facing your fear and moving forward." As the group began to disperse, Carlos hung back. "So," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye, "same time tomorrow." Sarah laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. "Let's not push it," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew she'd be back on the board soon. The ocean that had nearly taken her life had also given her a new purpose, a new strength she never knew she possessed. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she could still feel the gentle rocking of the waves. But for the first time since the attack, the sensation didn't fill her with dread. Instead, she felt a sense of accomplishment, of reconnection with a part of herself she thought was lost forever. She knew the road ahead was still long. There would be good days and bad days, moments of triumph and moments of fear. But Sarah was no longer afraid to face them. She was a survivor, stronger and more resilient than she had ever imagined. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's dreams were filled not with the terror of sharks' teeth and dark waters, but with the joy of dolphins leaping in the sun-dappled waves. And in those dreams, she was gliding across the water on her board, free and unafraid, ready to embrace whatever challenges the vast ocean of life might bring. The morning sun cast long shadows across the beach as Sarah stood at the water's edge, her paddleboard tucked under her arm. It had been 6 months since her first tentative return to the ocean, and in that time she had made remarkable progress. Her leg, once mangled by shark teeth, now bore silvery scars, but had regained much of its strength and flexibility. As Sarah surveyed the calm waters before her, she felt a familiar mix of excitement and trepidation. Today was different from her usual therapy sessions or controlled paddling exercises. Today, she was venturing out alone for the first time since the attack. "You don't have to do this, you know," came a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see Carlos approaching, concern etched on his weathered face. She offered him a small smile. "I know, but I need to." Carlos nodded, understanding in his eyes. He had been there through every step of her recovery, from those first terrifying moments in the water to her gradual rebuilding of confidence. "Just remember," he said, "stick to the plan. Stay within sight of shore, and if anything feels off, I know," Sarah interrupted gently. "Head back immediately. Don't worry, Carlos, I've got this." As she prepared to enter the water, Sarah ran through her mental checklist. She had her emergency whistle, a waterproof radio, and a specially designed shark deterrent device strapped to her ankle. She knew these precautions wouldn't guarantee her safety, but they helped calm her nerves. With a deep breath, Sarah pushed her board into the gentle surf and climbed on, her movements fluid and practiced. As she began to paddle out, she heard Carlos call out, Remember, we're all watching from here. You're not alone. Sarah raised her hand in acknowledgement, then focused on the horizon. The water was clear and calm, perfect conditions for paddling. As she moved further from shore, she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but this time it was tinged with excitement rather than fear. For the first half hour, Sarah stayed relatively close to the beach, parallel to the shoreline. She could see the small crowd that had gathered to watch her, fellow patients from the rehab center, staff members, and even a few locals who had heard about her story. Their presence was both comforting and slightly unnerving. As she settled into a rhythm, Sarah found her mind wandering to the events that had brought her to this point. The attack felt like a lifetime ago, yet the memories were still vivid. She could recall with perfect clarity the moment she saw the shark, the searing pain as its teeth tore into her flesh, the struggle to survive. But now, those memories were tempered by others. The unwavering support of her family and friends, the dedication of her therapists and doctors, the camaraderie she'd found with other survivors at the rehab center. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged stronger. Lost in thought, Sarah almost missed the dark shape that passed beneath her board. Her heart leapt into her throat, her body tensing automatically. For a moment, she was back in that terrible day, helpless and afraid. But then her training kicked in. Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to assess the situation calmly. The shape was too small for a shark, its movements too playful. As she watched, a sleek grey body broke the surface nearby. A dolphin. Sarah let out a shaky laugh. Relief flooding through her. "Hey there," she called out to the curious creature. "You gave me quite a scare." As if in response, the dolphin leapt from the water, performing an acrobatic flip before disappearing beneath the waves. Sarah found herself grinning, her earlier fear forgotten in the face of such joyful exuberance. Emboldened by the encounter, Sarah decided to paddle out a bit further. She knew she was pushing the boundaries of her agreed-upon plan, but the water was so inviting, the day so perfect. Just a little farther, she told herself. As she moved into deeper water, Sarah felt a shift in the energy around her. The waves became choppier, the current stronger. She adjusted her stance, confident in her ability to handle the changing conditions. It happened so quickly that Sarah barely had time to react. One moment, she was gliding smoothly across the water. The next, she was fighting to keep her balance. As a large wave caught her off guard, she teetered precariously, her arms windmilling as she struggled to stay upright. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought she would fall. Memories of her last fall, of the vulnerability she'd felt in the water, threatened to overwhelm her. But years of experience and months of intensive therapy had prepared her for this moment. With a determined grunt, Sarah shifted her weight, leaning into the wave instead of fighting it. She felt her board stabilize beneath her, riding out the turbulence. As the wave passed, she found herself still standing, breathless but upright. "I did it," she whispered, then louder, "I did it!" Her shout of triumph echoed across the water, and she could hear distant cheers from the shore. Sarah felt a surge of pride and accomplishment wash over her. She had faced her fear head-on and emerged victorious. As the adrenaline of the moment began to fade, Sarah realized how far she had drifted from shore. The beach was a distant strip of sand, the figures of her friends barely visible. A flicker of unease passed through her, but she pushed it aside. She was fine. She could handle this. Sarah turned her board, preparing to head back to shore when she felt it, a subtle change in the water around her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, a primal instinct screaming danger. Slowly, Sarah scanned the water around her. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then, about 50 feet away, she spotted it, a dorsal fin, cutting through the water with deliberate purpose. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. Time seemed to slow as her mind raced through her options. Stay still, try to outpace it, use the shark deterrent. Before she could decide, the fin disappeared beneath the surface. Sarah's eyes darted around, trying to spot where it might resurface. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. When the shark breached, it was much closer than Sarah had anticipated. She caught a glimpse of grey skin and black, lifeless eyes, as the creature leapt from the water, its powerful body arcing through the air mere feet from her board. Sarah's body reacted before her mind could process what was happening. She dropped to her stomach on the board, making herself as small a target as possible. Her hand fumbled for the shark deterrent on her ankle, finally managing to activate it. The device emitted a series of strong electrical pulses designed to overwhelm the shark's sensitive electroreceptors. Sarah held her breath, praying it would be enough to deter the predator. For several heart-stopping moments, Sarah lay frozen on her board, expecting at any second to feel the devastating impact of the shark's attack. But it never came. When she finally gathered the courage to look up, she saw the shark's fin retreating into the distance, driven away by the deterrent, or perhaps simply losing interest. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her entire body trembling. With the aftermath of adrenaline, she had faced her worst fear again and survived, but she knew she wasn't out of danger yet. She was still far from shore, in waters that had just proven to be shark territory. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled out her waterproof radio. "Carlos," she called, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm okay, but there's been a shark sighting. I'm heading back now." Carlos's voice crackled over the radio, tense with worry. "Copy that, Sarah. We've called the Coast Guard. They're on their way. Just stay calm and keep paddling. We've got eyes on you." Sarah tucked the radio away and began to paddle, her strokes powerful and determined. She kept her eyes focused on the shore, refusing to look back or think about what might be following her. The journey back felt interminable. Every splash, every shadow in the water sent a jolt of fear through Sarah. But she kept going, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. As she neared the shore, Sarah could see the crowd that had gathered. She could make out Carlos's figure, pacing anxiously at the water's edge. In the distance, she heard the whir of the Coast Guard helicopter approaching. With a final burst of energy, Sarah rode a wave into the shallows. The moment her board hit sand, hands were there, pulling her to safety. She collapsed onto the beach, her legs giving out as the adrenaline finally wore off. Sarah, are you all right?" Carlos was at her side, his face etched with concern. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She was shaking, she realized, a delayed reaction to the stress and fear. As the Coast Guard arrived and the crowd pressed in, full of questions and concern, Sarah found herself overwhelmed. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing just as Dr. Reyes had taught her. "Give her some space," she heard Carlos say, his voice firm but kind. The crowd backed off, leaving Sarah in a bubble of relative calm. When she opened her eyes again, she found Dr. Reyes kneeling beside her. "Sarah," the psychologist said gently, "can you tell me what happened out there?" Slowly, haltingly, Sarah recounted her experience. The initial joy of paddling alone, the encounter with the dolphin, the sudden appearance of the shark. As she spoke, she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. When she finished, Dr. Reyes regarded her with a mix of concern and pride. "You handled that situation remarkably well, Sarah. You stayed calm, you used your training, and you got yourself to safety. How are you feeling now?" Sarah considered the question. Carefully. "Shaken," she admitted. "Scared, but also, I don't know, proud, I guess. I faced my worst fear out there, and I survived." Again, Dr. Reyes nodded approvingly. "That's a very healthy perspective. This experience was traumatic, certainly, but it's also a testament to how far you've come. You didn't let fear paralyze. You acted." As the adrenaline continued to fade, Sarah found herself overcome with exhaustion. Carlos and Dr. Reyes helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way back to the rehab center. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, replaying the events of the day, she was surprised to find that alongside the lingering fear, there was a sense of accomplishment. She had pushed her boundaries, faced her deepest fear, and come out the other side. She knew that this experience would likely set her recovery back somewhat. The nightmares might return, the anxiety might spike again. But Sarah also knew that she had the tools and the strength to handle it. She had proven to herself beyond any doubt that she was a survivor. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last thoughts were not of terror or teeth, but of the open water, the sun on her face, the freedom she had felt on her board. The ocean had tried to claim her twice now, and twice she had emerged victorious. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah knew she was ready to face them, one wave at a time. Sarah stood at the edge of the water, her toes sinking into the wet sand as the gentle waves lapped at her feet. It had been a year since the shark attack that had nearly claimed her life, and 6 months since her close encounter during her solo paddleboarding session. The scars on her leg had faded to silvery lines, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But the mental scars, while less obvious, were still very much present. "Are you sure about this?" Carlos asked, standing beside her with a concerned look on his face. Sarah took a deep breath, inhaling the salty air. "As sure as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Today marked a significant milestone in Sarah's recovery. After months of therapy, both physical and psychological, she was ready to lead her first paddleboarding tour since the attack. It was a small group, just 3 tourists who had specifically requested her as their guide, having heard her story. Dr. Reyes approached, clipboard in hand. "How are you feeling, Sarah? On a scale of 1 to 10, where's your anxiety level?" Sarah considered for a moment. "Maybe a 6. I'm nervous, but excited too." Dr. Reyes nodded approvingly. "That's perfectly normal. Remember your coping strategies, and remember, Carlos will be out there with you as backup. You're not alone in this." As if on cue, the 3 tourists approached. There was a young couple, Mark and Lisa, both in their late 20s, and an older man, Bob, who looked to be in his 60s. "Are you Sarah?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "We've read so much about you. You're an inspiration." Sarah felt a flush creep up her neck. Even after all this time, she still wasn't entirely comfortable with the attention her story had garnered. "Thanks," she said, managing a smile. "I'm just glad to be back out on the water. Are you all ready for some paddleboarding?" As Sarah led the group through the safety briefing, she felt a sense of familiarity wash over her. This was what she loved, sharing her passion for the ocean with others. The nervousness began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence. "Remember," she said, as they prepared to enter the water, "stay close to me and Carlos. If you see any marine life, don't panic. Most creatures are just curious and won't bother us if we don't bother them." They paddled out, the water calm and clear. Sarah kept a watchful eye on her group, making sure they were comfortable and stable on their boards. As they moved further from shore, she felt the old thrill of being on the open water return. "Look," Mark suddenly called out, pointing to their left. "What's that?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario. But as she turned to look, she saw a pod of dolphins playing in the distance. "Those are bottlenose dolphins," she explained, her voice filled with wonder. "They're incredibly intelligent and playful creatures." The group watched in awe as the dolphins leapt and dove, their sleek bodies glistening in the sunlight. Sarah found herself smiling, genuinely enjoying the moment. As they continued their tour, Sarah pointed out various sights. A sea turtle, gliding beneath them, colorful fish darting around the coral reefs, even a majestic frigate bird soaring overhead. Her knowledge and enthusiasm were infectious, and soon the group was peppering her with questions. "Sarah," Bob asked during a lull in the action, "if you don't mind me asking, how did you find the courage to come back out here after what happened?" Sarah paused, considering her answer carefully. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "There were days when I thought I'd never be able to look at the ocean again, let alone get back on a board. But the ocean has been such a huge part of my life for so long. I couldn't let fear take that away from me." She paddled a bit closer to the group. "I had an amazing support system. The staff at the rehab center, my family and friends, even strangers who reached out after hearing my story. And I learned that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about facing your fears and moving forward anyway." Lisa wiped a tear from her eye. "That's beautiful, Sarah. Thank you for sharing that with us." As they turned to head back to shore, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. She had done it. She had led a successful tour, shared her love of the ocean, and faced her lingering fears head-on. But the ocean, as Sarah well knew, could be unpredictable. They were about halfway back when Sarah noticed a change in the water. The previously calm surface was becoming choppy, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. "Looks like a storm's rolling in," Carlos called out, paddling closer to the group. "We should pick up the pace." Sarah nodded, trying to keep the worry out of her voice as she addressed her clients. "All right, everyone, we're going to head back a bit faster now. Remember your paddling technique and stay close together." As they increased their speed, the wind picked up, making it harder to control their boards. Sarah could see Mark and Lisa struggling to keep up, while Bob was falling behind. "Carlos," she called out, "can you stay with Mark and Lisa? I'll drop back and help Bob." Carlos looked uncertain. "Are you sure? I can take Bob if you want." Sarah shook her head. "I've got this. Just get them to shore safely." As Carlos moved ahead with the young couple, Sarah paddled back to Bob. The older man was visibly tired, his strokes becoming weaker and less coordinated. "You're doing great, Bob," Sarah encouraged, pulling up alongside him. "We're going to get through this together, okay? Just follow my lead." The sky darkened further, and Sarah could hear the distant rumble of thunder. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to panic now. Bob was relying on her. They were still a good distance from shore when the first large wave hit. Sarah managed to ride it out, but Bob wasn't so lucky. His board tipped, sending him crashing into the churning water. "Bob!" Sarah cried out, immediately going into rescue mode. She paddled to where he had fallen, scanning the water frantically. When Bob surfaced, he was coughing and sputtering, clearly disoriented. Sarah maneuvered her board close to him. "Grab onto my board," she instructed, her voice firm but reassuring. "That's it, just hold on. I'm going to get you back on your board." As Sarah helped Bob clamber back onto his paddleboard, she became acutely aware of their vulnerability. They were alone in increasingly rough waters, with a storm bearing down on them. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her, but then Sarah remembered her training, all the hours she'd spent preparing for situations just like this. She took a deep breath, centering herself. "Bob," she said, making sure she had his attention, "I know you're tired, but I need you to paddle as hard as you can. I'll be right beside you the whole time. We're going to get through this together." With Sarah's encouragement and guidance, they began to make progress towards the shore. The waves were getting bigger, the wind stronger, but Sarah refused to give in to fear. She kept talking to Bob, offering words of encouragement and instruction. As they neared the beach, Sarah could see figures waiting for them. Carlos, Dr. Reyes, and what looked like emergency services. A wave of relief washed over her. With a final burst of energy, they rode a large wave into the shallows. Hands reached out to help them, pulling them to safety just as the heavens opened up and rain began to pour down. Sarah collapsed onto the sand, her body trembling with exhaustion and leftover adrenaline. She felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Dr. Reyes kneeling beside her. "You did it, Sarah," the psychologist said, her voice filled with pride. "You faced an emergency situation and handled it beautifully. How are you feeling?" Sarah took a moment to assess herself. Her heart was still racing, and she could feel the familiar tendrils of anxiety creeping in. But underneath that was something else, a sense of accomplishment, of strength. "I'm okay," she said, surprising herself with the truth of the statement. "It was scary, but I knew what to do. I didn't freeze up." Dr. Reyes smiled. "That's incredible progress, Sarah. You should be very proud of yourself." As the adrenaline began to fade, the full impact of what had just happened hit Sarah. She had faced not just her fear of the ocean, but a genuine emergency situation, and she had come through it not just unscathed, but victorious. Later that evening, after the storm had passed and statements had been given to the Coast Guard, Sarah found herself back on the beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The ocean, so turbulent just hours before, was now calm, the gentle waves reflecting the colors of the sunset. Carlos approached, handing her a steaming mug of tea. "Quite a day, huh?" he said, settling into the sand beside her. Sarah nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "I keep thinking about what could have gone wrong," she admitted. "If I had panicked, if I hadn't been able to help Bob." "But you didn't panic," Carlos interrupted gently. "You kept your cool. You remembered your training and you got everyone to safety. That's what matters." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beneath the horizon. Sarah found herself reflecting on her journey From the terror of the shark attack to the grueling months of recovery, and now to this moment of quiet triumph. "I think I'm ready," she said suddenly. Carlos looked at her quizzically. "Ready for what?" Sarah took a deep breath, hardly believing the words, even as she spoke them. "Ready to compete again. The Molokai 2 Oahu race is in 6 months. I think I want to do it." Carlos's eyes widened in surprise. The Molokai 2 Oahu was one of the most challenging paddleboard races in the world, crossing 32 miles of open ocean between the Hawaiian islands of Molokai and Oahu. Before her attack, Sarah had been training for it. "Are you sure?" Carlos asked. "That's a big step." Sarah nodded, a sense of certainty settling over her. "I'm sure. I know it won't be easy. I'll have to train harder than I ever have before, both physically and mentally. But I need to do this. For me." Carlos studied her for a moment, then broke into a wide grin. "Well then, I guess we better start training. You've got a race to win." As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. The ocean had nearly taken her life, had certainly changed it forever, but it had also given her a strength she never knew she possessed. A resilience that went bone deep. She knew the path ahead would be challenging. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt and fear, but Sarah was ready to face them. She was a survivor, a warrior, and she was ready to write the next chapter of her story, one wave at a time.